Today's the basics of property management. This is either if you are representing clients and actually going to create a property management arm to your business, or maybe you're just looking to invest yourself and you want to start self-managing your own investment portfolio, which is what I do. So just a little bit about myself. I'm a second generation real estate investor. I've been in real estate, it seems like my whole life, but I've been a licensed agent for 14 years. I'm a broker associate with eXp. I've been with them for almost 9 years, and I co-own OKC Home Investments with my husband, where we have flipped hundreds of properties, anything from single family to commercial strip centers to apartment complexes to now we're doing absolute net leases with restaurants. So little bit of everything is what we've done, and kind of learn the hard knocks way of just getting in there and doing it, and that's how you learn, right? So if you guys had a chance to attend my real estate investing class last week, we shared with you how I turned our initial $25,000 investment about 10 years ago into a multi-million-dollar portfolio in less than 5 years. If you didn't get it to attend, no worries. If you want to just send me a private message, I'd be happy to share with you the recording of that class, but of course you won't get any CE credit for not being there live. Master Lead Generator, we have a team of about 8 agents on our production team in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, where we lead generate and teach our agents how to lead generate, as well as thousands of agents all over the country that we work with, just like you guys. I think Jillian mentioned it. She's interested in property management, but mother of 4 kids. So for me, I'm married, mother of 2 boys. I don't have 4, but they're definitely enough to keep my hands full. So with that said, everything that I want to share with you today is how to create systems and processes that are duplicatable. Because the biggest thing, as Jessica just mentioned, is how do you keep the communication, the line of communication open, which is really important when you're dealing with owners of a complex, when you're dealing with tenants and you're dealing with maintenance staff. How do you stay in compliance, but also more importantly, how do you keep those open lines of communication and make sure that you're not skipping a beat? And one of the best ways that you're going to do that is by having systems and processes to scale. Quick disclaimer is everybody's market is different. So please check with your local guidelines as well as your managing broker. I know that there's brokerages out there that don't necessarily focus on property management. So I would recommend checking with your brokerage and your managing broker before getting into property management, because some companies actually don't allow it. I know for me, I'm at a point where I'm not doing property management any longer for others, because there are, some pros and cons that we'll definitely talk about today, but it's something that I do for my own personal investments. Now, what's been your biggest challenge? I know a lot of you said that you haven't done property management yet, but I would like to open it up. If you can open up your mic or put in the chat, what's been your biggest challenge? Either if you started property management or maybe you haven't gotten started yet, what is stopping you?
My biggest challenge was that trying to get the maintenance crew to go in and service the apartments in a timely manner, and then trying to relate information back to the renter as to the timeline and when that's going to get done.
Absolutely. So really finding the right maintenance staff that you can hold accountable and get the job done correctly. Awesome. Andrea said repairs request. Pratish said system, software, staffing. That's system, software, and staffing. The 3 S's, the 3 big S's, right? All good stuff. That's really going to be your step number 1, is starting to create those affiliate partnerships, because any good property manager is going to have a Rolodex of handyman, service workers, for a couple different things. Obviously, people that can get the job done and get it done in a timely manner, but also that aren't going to charge an arm and a leg, right? Because of course, if you're just hiring anybody and you're sending these massive bills to your property owner, or even if you own the property yourself, you would imagine that they're probably going to look elsewhere. So you need somebody that's definitely willing to work on their prices, but they also do good service and they do it in a timely manner. I know my parents, growing up, besides being real estate investors, they actually owned a garage door company. And for the sake of confidentiality, I won't say which property management company that they worked with, but they worked with a really large local property management company, and they did all the garage door service work. So they knew that Anybody that came from that property management company, because obviously it was a big account, it was reoccurring. So there was a smaller service call fee than what they charged the general public. And of course, it took priority in terms of service. So, those are the type of relationships that you'll want to create. So Jillian, you said can't focus on the amount of time needed to get started due to the current schedule and having little ones and not in school. Completely understand. The good thing is you're getting everything started now. So when the time is right, you'll be able to get started. So first thing you have to ask yourself, what are your goals? And we know that we all should create anything that we do, any business plan, whether it's property management, real estate investing, real estate sales, we should create SMART goals. So SMART goals standing for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely goals. So any goal without something to measure, you can't manage it if you're not measuring it. Anything without a timeline is just a wish. It's not an actual goal. So here's the reality is 30% of all homes in the United States are occupied by tenants. So we know that that's a big market. I think Jillian mentioned earlier, she works with investors. Why is she referring those clients to somebody else when we know that's a third of the business in the real estate space when we could be doing it ourselves? Now, you have to also look at what's your business plan going to be? Are you going to go after long-term or short-term rentals? So short-term meaning your Airbnb, your VRBOs, those type of things. I have some of our real estate partners that work in the local market and they love the Airbnb space. They love to go in and buy, go to garage sales, buy furniture, furnish the houses, go in, have a cleaning crew, do the VRBO or the Airbnb. And they do tend to make a little bit more money as far as cash flow than a long-term tenant. Now, the difference with a long-term tenant is for the most part, not always, it's kind of a set it and forget it. So for us, our minimum long-term is 12 months. So we don't renew anything less than 12 months. And I would rather make a little bit less cash flow because we know time is money. So you got to look at your ROI and your ROT. ROI standing for return on investment and your ROT is return on time. So although I can make more money with a short-term rental, it's also going to take a lot more time. And we know time is money with any business plan. So it's really just dependent on what you and your specific goals are. Are you going to be doing residential single family homes? Are you going to do multifamily, which multifamily is about 4 units and up? So that could be, your quads, your apartment complexes, etc. Or are you going to start getting into commercial or retail? Now, some of the benefits of like multifamily over single families, you can have, let's say you're managing 50 units, for example. As a single family, obviously those 50 units are all under single roofs and they're spread out all throughout the city. So maybe a little bit more difficult to manage. Whereas if you get a 50 unit apartment complex, for the most part, they're all under the same roof. They're in the same area. It's a little bit easier to manage in terms of some of those service calls. Now, in my opinion, when you get over 50 units at an apartment complex, and this is just from my personal experience, you should have on-site staff and on-site maintenance people. It gets a little bit tricky when you're below 50 units as far as a standpoint where it makes sense financially. I've owned apartment complexes that were like 30 units, 32 units. From that standpoint, we were active and we were there every day, but it didn't make sense to have full-time maintenance staff. So really the threshold where I believe that it makes sense to have full-time staff is about 50 units and up. And like I said, you can really streamline the process. You can put out notices and go do your monthly bug or your quarterly bug sprays, whatever it is. You can do your maintenance calls, all of your heat and air. Of course, it's under the same roof. So there's some pros and cons of single family versus multifamily. Now, one of the cons of multifamily is, again, everybody's under the same roof, right? So instead of having 50 families spread out throughout the city, you now have 50 families under the same roof. And of course, people like to tell on each other and they like to create drama. That's just kind of the human nature, right? So there are pros and cons of both. So what is your personal business plan going to be? As interest rates continue to rise, hopefully they don't continue, there will be an increase in tenants. So, we, of course, the last few years, we've had extremely beneficial interest rates, and we know that there's a lot less buyers right now, just in the nature of the interest rates continuing to rise. So that's something to think about. Also, probably in the next 12, 24 months, we're going to start getting an influx of short sales and foreclosures, which are going to cause those previous homeowners to become tenants as well. So how many units can you handle? This is one thing that you want to start looking at right now if you're looking to get into property management. What can you reasonably handle by yourself? And then at what point do you need to start leveraging? And that's going to be full-time or part-time. So you have to consider, are you going to go all in? Are you going to do this full-time, or are you doing this part-time just as a supplemental income to probably your real estate sales? So Andrea asked, can you hire a manager with no license to help managing rental properties, single family? So there definitely are people that work in apartment complexes that are not licensed, but there's a lot of limitations. So in my personal opinion, and this is just my opinion, and I can open it up to see what everybody else thinks, I think it's always beneficial to have somebody that's licensed. I know when we operated, my husband always kind of operated as the manager where I was doing the operations, but I, of course, was licensed and he wasn't. So, we didn't have those limitations. So I think it's a good mix because if you're not licensed, there are some limitations. But does anybody have any feedback on that question? Okay, so again, check with your managing broker on local guidelines. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. I muted myself. You can hear me now, right? Okay. Just testing. You guys can hear me. Yes, no, maybe so. Okay, Liz said yes. Thank you. All right. Like I said, check with your managing broker for local and legal guidelines because every county, every market is going to vary just so briefly. So where to start? Of course, research your local and legal guidelines. Talked about that. Get a state specific lease. For me, I actually just use the OREC leases. I mean, for the most part, they do everything that I want it to do as far as residential. My commercial leases, I actually have I have a template that I use, and then my attorney kind of customizes it based on those longer term leases because those tend to be 5, 10, 15-year leases. So I definitely get legal advice on those longer term leases. Take specialized courses. Obviously, you're doing that today. And then, of course, what is your niche? What is your niche going to be? How many properties? Are you going full-time? Are you going part-time? Are you going to do residential, multifamily, commercial, etc.? And then another thing, if you want to get started and you have no idea where to get started, is it's always a good idea in any new industry that you want to get acclimated with is ask to be an intern or work for another property manager just to get your feet wet, especially if this is something that you want to become a full-time business. Create strategic partnerships. So as Jessica mentioned, having those affiliates, having those handymen, those maintenance workers, contractors that you can trust that are going to get the job done correctly, but also more importantly in a timely manner, and also not breaking the bank for the property owners. So definitely finding those balance. They are out there. With that said, you have to just continue to interview and get quotes until you have the right partnerships. We just changed a heat and air unit on one of our restaurant complexes, and we had, for the exact same unit, had quotes range from $45,000 all the way up to almost $70,000. So again, every company works a little bit differently. So instead of just getting one quote, maybe you need to get 10 quotes until you find some heat and air people that you enjoy working with and that will get the job done. Then you need to start building a client database. So of course, if you're in real estate sales, then I think as Jillian mentioned, if you maybe already have some people that are looking to start renting out the properties, especially if you're working with investors. If not, then you want to start building that database from now. Even if you're not looking to do this 2 years from now, but you can always start that process from now. Best practice guidelines. I think it's, especially if you're going to start scaling and start hiring on staff, it's good to have a procedures manual. It's good to have best practices because although property management can be incredibly profitable, it's actually very tricky as well. And there's a lot of liability attached to it. So definitely start creating and developing your best practices from now. Becoming resourceful. That's the biggest key to any good property manager is how resourceful are you? And then, like I said, having those strategic partnerships. Learn basic accounting. I mean, they're very much part of any property management is the accounting software and the systems, which eventually you could delegate out, but of course it might be beneficial for you to learn in the beginning. And then research the best advertising syndications. There's a lot of them out there. And I also have on here, check out biggerpockets.com. If you're not familiar with their podcasts, they're a very investor friendly podcast. They do anything from syndications to flip properties to buy and hold to property management. So there's just a lot of different resources in terms of podcasts, as well as calculators that are on Bigger Pockets. So if you haven't heard of them, I would definitely check it out. Just checking here if anybody has any questions. Nope. Okay. So you have to treat it like a business. You're going to hear me say this over and over and over again. A lot of us that are in real estate, we are people, we're people pleasers. We want to make everybody happy. That's why we're in this industry, right? So you have to find that balance of treating it like a business and really being able to have a firm hand as well. So if you treat property management like a hobby, it's going to pay you like a hobby. It might even cost you in court. So you might have some tenants that are getting behind and you're like, okay, we can work it out. I'm going to show you strategic ways that you can work it out where it's protecting you and it's protecting them. I'm not one that I ever let a tenant go over 30 days with being past due. I just let them know that I reconcile our accounting every single month and then it has to be up to date, which is the absolute truth. So it's just kind of boggling to me when I talk to property owners or I talk to property management companies and they're letting their tenants go 3, 4, 5, 6 months without any recourse, because at that point, you're not doing them any favors as well. Maybe you think that you're helping them, but you're actually not, because nobody's going to be able to get caught up if they're that far behind on rent. Whereas vice versa, if you really hold them true to that monthly, maybe you create a payment schedule instead of just having it all in one lump sum. So you're willing to work with them, but you're not letting them get so far behind that they can never get caught up. Then you are doing them more of a favor because they're going to figure it out instead of spending money on things that are not important. I have a handful of tenants that I know that never pay on time, but they always let me know at the beginning of the month what day they're going to pay on, and then they pay on that day. So I definitely give them some flexibility, but they never go over 30 days. So you've got to find that balance and be able to be firm. Otherwise, unfortunately, they're going to walk all over you. You also owe that fiduciary responsibility to your clients. So if you're doing property management for others, then you do owe that fiduciary responsibility to make sure that you're treating it like a business. Andrea asked, do you charge them a late fee? Absolutely. And here's why. And I'll actually share with you the late fee. It's $50 a month, so it's not anything that's crazy. And the reason why our late fees are $50 a month is because I have been in court and I've had to evict tenants. And this is what I find, that even though I'm not a lawyer. So, full disclaimer, I'm not an attorney, but what I've heard the judges say is 50 is a reasonable late fee, that anything over that, they actually don't consider that reasonable. Here's the other reason. And it's really, really difficult. If you don't charge them a late fee and then they're late on other months and all of a sudden you decide to start implementing it, they're not going to understand why you didn't implement it before. And then now you're implementing it and they're going to get mad at you. Also, you want to make sure that you're being fair to everyone. So I can't charge some tenants a late fee and others not a late fee. So when I talked, in the previous slide about best practices, my software system actually implements the late fee after the third, which is what our contract says. If the payment's not made before the third, then there's a late fee. So I have my software set up to where it automatically adds the late fee for me. And they know that. And then that way I don't worry about any kind of discrimination, not charging some while I'm charging others. It's done across the board. I know that can sound mean, but again, you've got to treat it like a business and you have to kind of have an iron thumb, but still be respectful and mindful that there might be some certain situations. We have dealt with situations where somebody might have some unexpected health conditions and things like that we've had to adjust. But for the most part, this is kind of how we operate. Does anybody have any questions or maybe any comments on that? Is anybody reluctant to charge a late fee? Good. Okay, we're all on the same page. So be mindful, of course, as mentioned, fair housing do's and don'ts, especially in the tenant space. Check income, credit history, et cetera. We do an application process for every single tenant, or excuse me, every single applicant that comes through. We never tell somebody over the phone that they can't get qualified. We say there's a process. We have certain criteria that we look at. Here's the application link. Go fill it out. There is an application fee. Be a business owner. You need to be familiar with the local laws. There's a lot of great resources. I mean, I used to go down to the HUD office. They're always having classes, the Section 8, OHFA, et cetera. They're always having different classes. Just go in, even if you're not doing property management yet, but go in and listen to those Section 8 classes, listen to the fair housing and all of that. And you're going to learn a lot, because some things, there's simple things that you might be doing that could eventually get you in some hot water. Button up your lease agreements. There's, again, that's where you'd want to get with an attorney. I personally use the state OREC contract, but we do have some different clauses per our attorney that we work with. Here's the key. You want to be firm, but fair. That's really how we operate. We have to be firm. We understand when there are certain situations where we need to be fair, but we also know that we're not doing them any business if we're too lenient. So implement fines and fees across the board. As I just mentioned, our software automatically implements the late fees, so there's no discrimination. We're not charging it for some, not charging others, that it's per the contract. Don't bend because it will hurt the tenant, and it will backfire in court. Like I said, if you try to be too lenient, I have seen situations where it does backfire, especially if you find yourself in front of a judge. So just follow the lease, follow the rules, and follow what your lease says. So Liz asked, are the lead-based paint disclosures required for leasing? Absolutely. So if it's built previous to 1978, you need to make sure that you have your lead-based paint disclosure, which I actually think we have that on one of our slides here. Andrea asked, when and how do you check the applicants to qualify them? So the Buildium, which is the property management software that I use, but there's definitely other softwares out there, does have an application link. So if they do it through ours, it will run a full credit check. It'll check their employer history. And then of course, if they have any previous landlords that we can reach out to. So everything is done in our property management software. You don't have to, you have to train your tenants. Again, if you start out the lease and you start out lenient, that's how they're going to expect you to be for the life of the lease. So you almost have to become firm from the beginning so they know that how it's going to be for the rest of the term. Create a residential selection criteria sheet and place on your site. Tenants can review prior to their application and background check. So this can be just a simple checklist of what the criteria is that you guys look for across the board. Maybe you want the rent, you want 2 times the income. Maybe you need a certain credit score, etc. What is that going to be? That's different for every complex. Get a copy of the Social Security and driver's license and bank records. Reason why I have bank records is if you ever have to put yourself in a position where you get a judgment and you need to make withdrawals, of course, you need their banking information. 9 times out of 10, if you've already gone to court, they're not going to give you that information unless the judge makes them. So just ask for those type of documents up front and save them in a safe place. Place any judgment for collection. So, I mean, I can't tell you how many collections I've had to create over the years. I don't necessarily see that money, but of course it can hurt their credit. So they tend to pay it off when they want to go purchase a house or a car or something like that. So a lot of times you can put any judgment for free with a collection agency. And then if they are able to collect, they're going to take a percentage. Do they owe and are they making payments? So of course you can create a payment plan as well. Applicants should be first come, first served to avoid discrimination. I know in the past, there were situations where I've seen people just take any and every applicant, and kind of the best practices that I've heard just from my personal experience in classes that I've taken is that you really should take applications first come, first serve, and then either approve or deny and then go on to the next one. Again, to avoid any kind of possibility of discrimination. Applicants you need applications for anyone over the age of 18 that's going to be considered a legal adult in the residence. So if there's a husband and wife, or there's two adults, or they're roommates, anybody over the age of 18, it's good practice to get an application. Make a move-in inspection checklist and document. So, I mean, that's just as it sounds like, walk through, take photos. You should always have photo documentation when somebody moves in. And then when somebody moves out, that way, in case you do ever have to go before a court or a judge, or there's ever anything in question, then you have documentation. So I personally keep all the photos in a Google Drive. I document the month and the year, and then we take pictures before and after. Keep proof of any repairs before and after as well. So, because it's amazing to you when tenants are behind on their rent, one of the first things they like to go do is say that you haven't fixed something that they have requested that you fix, even though any judge will tell you from my experience that rent being behind has nothing to do with any repairs, but it's amazing how many excuses they will come up with. So document, 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 and then document some more. I don't think as a property manager, you can over document, you can be less organized. I mean, you have to be incredibly organized to protect yourself. So find and screen the right tenants, again, based on what your best practices, based on what your standards are going to be. But of course, go by legal, and then of course be, mindful of any kind of discrimination. Advertise proactively. We advertise a big mix of both online and offline. So of course, signage, but then also online advertising. Monitor day-to-day activities. Okay, so Andrea said, where do you check the applicants to qualify them? So again, I use the software company Buildium. That's the management software that I use, and it has an application link that it checks everything for us. And then we go in and just validate ourselves. So what is your niche, your ideal client and market? Constantly innovate, create systems to win. Automation is key. It's a really good best practice to create a company policy and a standard operations procedure. Again, this is going to help you avoid any discrimination. It's also going to help you leverage if you want to start duplicating your software and your systems and start hiring staff. Anytime you start hiring, it's a good best practice to have a company policy and an SOP just to keep everybody in the same page. Just in case somebody does go astray, you can bring them back in alignment with maybe the company policy and procedures that they have agreed to. Track your client's bottom line, reduce expenses. I've seen a lot of property managers that just either ignore repairs, or they hire maintenance people that just kind of do it 50-50, if you will, but then also they hire people that are so incredibly expensive. So your job as a property manager is not only to make the tenants happy, to make sure everything gets repaired in a timely manner, but also to protect and have a fiduciary responsibility for your client, which is typically the property owner. So by reducing their expenses, they're going to be more happy with you. Network and build affiliations. One of the best things that you can do to start building affiliations with a lot of investors is if you just go to eventbrite.com, that's EVENTBRITE, there's always investor and wholesaler and property manager meetups that, I mean, pretty much on a regular basis that you can go to. So that's a great way to start building that network. Open communication between tenant and landlords. Even if you don't have anything to update your landlord, I think you should have some kind of open communication, just letting them know what's going on, even if it's just a summary of what's going on, either on a weekly or at minimum a monthly basis. And of course, having those open lines of communication between the tenant as well. If you have tenants, even if you have 100% occupancy, which is usually not the case, and you're not properly communicating, people are not going to recommend your property management services, are not going to recommend your apartment complex, etc. So that's one of the biggest complaints that I hear is I've gone to the property manager, but they haven't responded. That's one of the biggest keys. So if you can find a way to have that open communication, that's going to be key. And then of course, you can utilize things like your quarterly inspections. So of course, you need to give your proper legal notice to be able to go through everybody's unit. But you can use that as an excuse to do an inspection during a regular bug spray time. So for us, when we owned our apartment complex, we would have somebody come spray either monthly or quarterly, and we would use that as an opportunity to go document, take photos, to really kind of do an inspection of the units. Do we have any questions so far?
Do you have to notify them if you are using that opportunity as inspection time? Do you have to notify them that you will be inspecting?
I think that would be a good practice. I mean, legally, I don't know if you have to. I mean, that would be kind of a legal question, but I always think that it's, you know, anytime you do any kind of form, just let them know that you're going to do a bug spray between the hours of 9 to 5, and during the same time, management will be doing a walkthrough and inspecting the units. So it goes back to communication. I don't think you can over communicate and just be true and honest, but you're kind of killing two birds with one stone, if you will, and getting those both done at the same time. I mean, we had one last week that I had to send notification that we're going to go do an inspection this week because my husband went over there and they had 5 dogs in the house. And I looked at their contract and they were only allowed to have one service animal dog, and any other pets needed to be, it's literally written in our contracts. Any other pets need to be approved by the landlord or owner prior to, and of course, there's never been any communication. So we sent out a notice that we'll be doing an inspection this week and that there is concern of extra animals in the house than what was approved per the lease. Does anybody want to add to that? Anybody have any examples that they've had to deal with this? Okay, awesome. Can you guys just give me a yes and let me know that you're still here? You're sticking around? Go ahead and put a yes in the chat. Great, awesome. So here's some basic things, you know, showing assistance. They're okay to show the property, but cannot execute the lease. That goes back to if they're not a licensed agent, there are some limitations. So you can have some showing assistance. How do you verify the service animal? We just asked for a certificate, but that is one of those things that is very hard to verify, just because the nature that people can go online and get, you know, psychiatric service animal certificates. And it's not just a service dog anymore. There's like miniature donkeys, there's all kinds of things. So you just have to do the best without over questioning them. He did let us know in this particular case that he had a service dog, which we approved because obviously you can't deny somebody on having a service dog, and you can't charge a pet fee if they have a service dog. But I don't think anybody ever has 5 service dogs. So unless he can provide some kind of documentation saying different, those are all probably just domestic dogs. So Jessica says, I had to ask for a physician's note stating the tenant's medical need for one. Yeah, you can do that. Like I said, there's a lot of different ways online that people can get it. So it is a little bit of a gray area that you have to be careful if. You need names on the lease of all the tenants and applicants. I learned this the hard way. I used to put the lease in like the primary's name. And then all of a sudden they would move in, you know, a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And so then you go and evict that individual, but then the other person is squatting. So I learned this just kind of in the nature of going to evictions, is when I have to send out a pay or quit notice. And again, this is not legal advice. This is just my personal experience. I always put the tenant's name and then I put and residents. So I'm addressing any and all residents, as well as anybody is on the original lease. And it states in our lease that anybody in additional has to be named. So Liz, you said tenants over 18. So here, this is just our personal process, is tenants over 18 have to be on the application and the lease. And then there is a section in our lease where it names any additional tenants, which would include any minors in their names. And then we have a best practice that we just add in that anybody additional to what's on the original lease needs to be approved in advance. So that would avoid anybody else moving in. Again, definitely recommend checking with an attorney just to make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's, right?
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. The question was asked about the lead-based paint. Absolutely make sure you get those disclosures, because last I checked, it could be higher now. It's $37,500 fine per occurrence. So imagine if you had a 50-unit apartment complex and you didn't have those lead-based paint disclosures, that would be $37,500 times 50. So
Micah?
definitely, yes.
Sorry, are there any other kind of disclosures that you need to provide the tenants? Or that you provide?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, there's a lot of different addendums and disclosures, but for the most part, those are the two key, or is the lease and then the lead-based paint disclosure.
Okay.
But then of course, when we start getting into the commercial leases, that's where I personally start getting my attorney involved.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Uh-huh. All deposits need to be held in escrow. This is not just for licensees. These are people that even are running their own investments. I've talked to a lot of different property owners and they're not holding the deposits in escrow. So deposits are always supposed to be held in escrow. Otherwise it's considered commingling, which is illegal. So make sure that you've got a separate escrow account. Preferably it's a non-interest bearing account. And then we even have a clause, or I think it's actually a separate receipt that we give our tenants, letting them know what account it's being held in. So anyone without a license cannot execute the lease. That is my understanding. If you're doing property management for other people, if you're doing property management for yourself, then you can execute a lease. But there are, of course, limitations if you're not licensed. Handicap, you have to make reasonable accommodations per HUD. So, if somebody moves into, let's say, an apartment complex and they need a ramp, or we've had situations where they needed specialized handicap parking. You have to make what you would consider a reasonable accommodation for those tenants. You cannot deny a registered service animal. We already kind of touched on that. Another thing that you need to take in consideration when you're writing up your leases or your best practices, are you going to allow tenants to sublease? And for us, it only is upon approval of the owner. So if somebody wants to sublease, which we haven't run into this too much, it has to get approved first. So are the RAs, the reasonable accommodations, your cost or theirs? This is, I think, depending on what it is, but in my experience, it's going to be a cost of the owner. So it's just one of those doing business costs that you have to be prepared for. And that's why it's always important to have money in escrow, to have reserves, because it's most likely going to be a cost of the property owner. Again, that's why it's really important to go to some of those HUD and Section 8 housing classes, because I've heard horror stories of people, things that you wouldn't think would be in a reasonable accommodation. And of course they go and get HUD involved and all of a sudden everybody gets in trouble. So it's good to hear some of those examples. I'm thinking of one that I think it was somebody that was legally blind. So they assumed they wanted the first floor and instead he wanted the second floor. They wouldn't give it to him. And then of course that individual got HUD involved. And so it just, you got to be really careful. So when in doubt, ask your broker, ask an attorney. That's kind of my rule of thumb. Where were we here? Okay. Cannot increase deposit based on the amount of residents or children. Again, that's where it's important to have a standard operations and best practices of how much deposit, because you can't charge different people deposits. Of course, if that's ever audited, that could get you in a lot of potential issues with discrimination. And of course, we all know the 7 protected classes are color, disability, familial status, origin, race, religion, and sex. Another great resource down here is oklaw.org. There's a lot of different blogs and information that you can go and take a look at. So do you have the right systems to scale? For us, we actually started using something simple as QuickBooks. When you have just a handful of properties, it does, for the most part, something that's manageable. But once you start getting to scale, you're going to need something that's probably a little more specific for property management, like Buildium, Appfolio, Avail. Those are just to name a few. Personally, I use Buildium. It does all of my accounting. It does my property management. Tenants can make their payments online. They can also fill out their applications online and read a credit report, as well as they each get their own tenant portal to track any past payments, repairs. They can put in maintenance requests, etc. So that's why I like Buildium. It's also scalable. So you pay based on there's different brackets based on how many units that you have. You can also give access to other people like property owners, your tenants, as well as your accountant or CPA. Also, It's probably a good practice to have like a protected Google Drive or Dropbox. Like I said, document photos, repairs, move-in photos, move-in inspections, things like that. We have a folder for every single property that we own and then every single tenant. So even if they moved out, then I'm still keeping that documentation of that tenant. So everything's just in one place. And then of course, if you're doing short-term rentals, you've got Airbnb, VRBO, you want to pay attention to reviews, and the ultimate goal is to become a super host. So I know with short-term rentals, it's hard to get those first few tenants, but as you do, then you start to get the reviews in, you start to get the super host status, and then it kind of snowballs from there. Create your own policy and procedures manual. We touched on that, but some of the things that it can include is your tenant screening, your eviction and late fee processes. But like I said, for fairness, you want to make sure that you're implementing all these processes. Cash for keys process. I mean, some people do this. Basically, there's situations where you might offer up, a little bit of money for people to move out and give you the keys and abandon the lease instead of having to take them through the whole eviction process. Because we know evictions are costly and they're timely and nobody ever wins. The property owner or the tenant does not win an eviction. And even though if you've documented everything and you're absolutely 100% sure you're going to win, I've seen cases where people still don't win in front of a judge. So if you can avoid court at all possible, it's always a good idea. Pets or no pets, are you going to allow pets? Of course, one of the things you want to talk with the property owners, services or emotional support animals. Of course, you have to allow if they've got proper documentation. Tenant repairs, are you going to charge a deductible? I was actually talking to a friend the other day that they were complaining about their rentals in Florida. They're like, oh my gosh, they call me for everything. They call me for a light bulb. They call me when they lock themselves out, et cetera. And I said, well, that's because you don't have a deductible in place. So what we implemented years and years ago, I think it's $75. So a $75 deductible for any repairs. And then we're charged over anything that's over $75. That's obviously normal wear and tear, right? So what that does is anything below $75, the tenant is responsible for. So that's going to avoid them calling you for every little thing, like a light bulb going out, like, they lost their garage door opener or they lock themselves out, etc. Jessica, thank you. I appreciate it. So that has drastically reduced. Now, do we charge it that often? Not really, because most of the time it's a legit reason for us to come out, but mentally it just has the tenant not call us for every little thing. We just had a situation where the house flooded from all the rain that's happening in Oklahoma. Obviously, I'm not going to charge them a deductible. That's something that's above and beyond their control, right? But again, it's just kind of setting that standard. Move in and out inspections. We talked about that. Reserve amount. How much are you going to have for those additional costs and fees? Because we all know, I mean, there was one month, I remember it was in December, we had 9 hot water tanks go out in an apartment complex all at the same time. So you definitely want to have reserves for things like that. Fee structure, escrow account for deposits. And then there is a big difference between pet fee versus pet deposit. So you can charge a pet deposit, but if you can't say a non-refundable pet deposit, because that's an actual pet fee. So if you're going to charge something that's non-refundable, I would call it a pet fee as opposed to a pet deposit, because a deposit needs to be held in escrow. Jillian, I see that you have a question.
Yes. Okay, so this just popped in my head, but so you said that you've got a property in Edmond that floods when you get bad rain. What happens if there's damage to, like, do you let the tenant know, hey, this property tends to flood with heavy rains? I'm sorry. Hey, Moxie, shh. It's my 3-year-old. Do you have to make them aware, and then that way they can take the additional steps needed to protect their personal property? I mean, I know that they're going to have renter's insurance, but is there any additional expectation of property management company or the landlord knowing that it floods? What if something what if the flooding is bad enough that it damages their personal property? Is there an expectation for you to help cover any of that? I guess is my thought.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, I don't know from a legal perspective, but I think, just to get yourself from getting in hot water, it's always a good idea to disclose. In this particular situation, we've actually had the same, because we don't have a huge turnover in our tenants. So we've had the same tenant there. And it just seems like once a year we have this issue, even though we put in guttering and French drains, and we're just constantly trying to figure out how we can continue to improve it. Luckily it's coming out from the vent, so it's not, I don't believe it's reached their personal property. But, it is a good idea to, if you have a reoccurring, which doesn't happen often, then I would definitely disclose and say, hey, we've had some previous leaks in the past. If there's any heavy rains, you might just kind of be aware and make note of that. So Jessica said, that's a good question. My sister's garage floods every time it rains and she's never told about this, nor the property management agency have done anything to help her out with the issue. Yeah. So again, I think, personally, I would want a good reputation and over communicate and over disclose. I don't think you can over disclose, in my opinion. Does anybody have any feedback on that? Okay, so you make a checklist, what tenant repairs, what repairs are the tenant going to be responsible for? What repairs are the landlord going to be responsible for? Where your security deposits going to be held in an escrow account, subcontractor affiliates and agreements, make ready and renovations, monthly and annual reports, mortgage, taxes, and insurance. Of course, like I said, you want to protect the property owner's bottom line. Property management named as an additional insured. Of course, on any kind of insurance policy is always a good idea. How are you going to accept payment? We actually outline that in our contracts, that tenants will have access to an online portal and they can make payments either directly through the online portal, or they can do direct deposit at our bank account, PayPal or Venmo, just to avoid anybody from trying to pay cash or check. Pay or quit notice. If you find yourself where a tenant is in default, then you want to send out a pay or quit notice. It's always a good practice to email it to them, to post it on their door. And I always take a picture because I've had judges ask, and then also send it certified mail with a return green card. So usually if you do all three of those, you pretty well protect yourselves. I've seen cases get thrown out because they've emailed it and they sent it certified mail, but they didn't post it on the door. And so we post it on the door and we take a photo and we document that photo. We put it in a Google Drive so you don't over document. And of course, smoke detectors and CO2 detectors, it's good practice to take photos for liability. So, I've heard situations where a house was rented out to some college students. They had a party, house caught on fire, and then the insurance tried to say they didn't have any smoke detectors and not pay on the claim. So I've heard a lot of horror stories like that. So I think it's a good idea to take photos and video and document. So Liz asks, how do you handle power outages, which happens frequent in Oklahoma? To be honest, I haven't really had any issues with that. Is there anything specific to that you have a question?
No, I was just wondering if you relocate them to hotels, or I don't know what landlords.
Yeah,
how they-
usually power outages, for the most part aren't aren't for an extended period of time. I know there's some unique scenarios. I've never had to move somebody to a hotel for a power outage. There have been situations where we've had unexpected repairs and we've had to relocate people for a few nights to a hotel, things that are out of their control. But power outage, I would say that's, in my personal opinion, that's really not a landlord's responsibility either.
Okay.
And again, that's just my opinion, but an attorney
Gotcha.
might say different. Real quick, before our break here, we have Isaac joining us. He is the sponsor for today's class. As you guys know, that we're offering a 5-week series of free CE classes, all thanks to Isaac at Mission Loans. And Isaac, if you don't mind, just kind of sharing for a few minutes about you and your business and how you help real estate agents.
Sure, you bet. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thanks.
Okay, good. Sorry, I'm having to dial in from my phone today, but no, thanks for having me. And I think that was just what I caught on the tail end of that last slide with regard to being a landlord. That was all really good stuff. And I've been one myself and had some things come up, and that's an awfully good checklist you got there. But yep, my name's Isaac Rice. I'm a loan originator, typically, just residential housing, 1 to 4 units. Definitely do more primary residence than investment, but we do a lot of investment in second home as well. And just really try to support our realtor partners in any way that we can. and really partnering with them at the same time as, making sure that the borrowers are very well taken care of and everyone's really informed. But yeah, we do pretty much all the major loan programs and down payment assistance and things like that. And just really I'm glad to, be a part of what you guys have going on, and would love to support, any of the agents on this call at any time with any questions that they have. And if anybody does have any quick lending questions, be happy to field them. And if there's anything anyone wants to have me specifically address.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions for Isaac?
That one. So my husband's doing flips right now, and that's like his main source of income. So how would you qualify him for a loan on something like that, where all he has to show is what he's made off of the last flip?
I gotcha. I think you may have asked a similar question last week, worded differently. But what we would do, I mean, if the flipping has been something that's been going on for an amount of time where that business enterprise income would have been documented in tax returns, that's what we would use for a standard loan. Now, I think are you talking about getting a loan to buy another flip specifically, or
Yeah.
buy and hold?
No, it would be another flip. So he would need like the money to purchase it, and then to like the construction loan after that.
Okay. Yeah. So in my side of the mortgage world, I call it more traditional mortgage lending, we would have to prove ability to repay based off of if that's the income, if that's the sole income that he has, that he would need to use to qualify. We would calculate that based off of the tax returns. And so it's one of those things where there are certain things that may be write-offs for the income that we may be able to add back in, such as depreciation or amortization of certain assets owned by the business. But in general, if you write down your income, like a lot of small business owners do, and avail themselves of the available tax laws, it can turn into you can have your cake, but you can't eat it too type situation. If the income were to be written down very low, such to mitigate the tax burden, then qualifying income would also be low in kind with that. On my side of the world, if we were just saying, hey, you need to buy a home, we need to prove ability to repay the way the government says we have to on loans that are going to be delivered to investors. So that's what we would do is base it off of tax returns, and if he has any other income from any other enterprises, we would consider all of that. But typically any type of self-employment income is averaged over a 2-year period. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's
Okay.
one of the hurdles he's having too, is because he does his taxes in a way to where it's like he can write off a bunch of stuff,
Sure.
but he's having problems finding programs where they will take all of those written off stuff back into consideration so that it proves,
Yeah.
income.
There's a bunch of rules on how that goes, but there's specific boxes and line items from tax returns, depending on how the business is set up and what forms that the taxes are done on. We take information from specific boxes, and some of them can be added back. And then in fact, some of them, such as like meals and entertainment expense, that actually gets subtracted completely. So there's different things that impact, qualifying income in different ways for self-employed borrowers. But I think last week's topic about, well, at least the portion that I was on the call for, was about establishing relationships with traditional or commercial bankers. That can be really important, and there may very well be some bankers who have a product they can put together that fits what your husband's looking to do, which is get financing for his next flip. But on my side of the world, where we have to follow the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac rules, that's how we would do it, is with the tax returns. And then, if it was a buy and hold property, you could look at a debt service coverage ratio loan. If it was going to be something that would be rented out. So yeah, that's a great question, but that's about as far into that particular one as I could help you with.
All right,
Anything
appreciate it.
else?
Any other questions for Isaac? Thank you so much, Isaac. If you don't mind putting your contact information. Our team is personally working with Isaac and Mission Loans. And as a matter of fact, we had a team meeting this morning and everybody's been super impressed with how he's been on it with our clients and our leads. So much appreciated. Thank you so much,
You bet.
Isaac.
Well, thank you. Yep, I'll drop that in the chat. See you next time.
Thank you. All right. So we are here. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Okay, so a payment agreement, I think that this is a good practice, especially for tenants that might have, certain situations where they can't pay in one lump sum. So instead of just agreeing verbally, I would have them sign this payment agreement, and you can simply Google or have your attorney draw one up. But this is essentially what it looks like. It's something that they would sign, the landlord would sign, and you can have a schedule of payments. I do this as I've got about, let's say two or three tenants that regularly have to make kind of scheduled payments that they're not able to do one lump sum, but they always pay on, every single month. We like I said, we don't let our defaults go over 30 days, but I always have them commit to a day that they can pay by and then have them put it in writing. And the reason for that being, let's say that the rent is due on the 1st, and per your contract, they have to pay before the 3rd, right? So then after the 3rd, it's in default, it's now late. Well, let's say they tell you that they're going to pay by the 15th. Well, if you don't have anything in writing from them and you wait until the 15th and for whatever reason they don't make that payment, now you've got to do the pay or quit notice, which could be 5 to 10 days before you can even file anything at the court. So now you've pretty much pushed it another couple of weeks. Whereas if you have something in writing and it's agreed upon, then you can let them know, you could probably argue that you gave the proper notice, or still send out, it's probably good practice to go ahead and send out the pay or quit notice, but give them to X amount of day to pay. Then after that date that they're in default. So again, just getting everything in writing, that way you're not just delaying the process. Unfortunately, I have had situations where tenants kind of know the system and they know the laws and they know how to buy time. I even have another tenant that we had to turn off his online portal to make payments, because every single 1st of the month he would make the payment and then it would get reversed by his bank due to insufficient funds. Well, that whole process would take about 8 days. So essentially, when this was happening month over month over month, we realized that he was just buying time. So we shut off his portal and then gave him notification that he has to either do a direct deposit or PayPal or Venmo. So certain situations that don't happen often, but you just kind of have to be mindful of any kind of repetitive behavior, right? So building your clientele and network. So networking is key for any good property manager, even in, as a real estate agent in general, we should be networking. And then of course, for those of us that want to work with investors, like I said, you can go to a lot of different investor meetups. If you're working with investors, you want to be a resource and lead with value. As we know, that investors are very savvy. They know what they're doing. They know the real estate market. They're going to work with real estate agents who know what they're doing in the investor world, because the investor world is much different than your traditional sales. So the more resourceful that you are, the more value that you have to them, and the more likely they are to work with you. You can also go to fundraisers and events, Rotary Club, affiliates, neighborhood farming. You could farm specific areas, and of course, social media. And then another way to get in touch with investors is through courthouse sales. So just out of curiosity, has anybody ever been to a courthouse sale or an auction? Does anybody want to go to one? Open the chat here. Okay.
I'd like to get this out of curiosity.
Say that again, Jessica. I'm sorry, you cut out.
Oh, I said I'd like to go to one out of curiosity, how they work. Are they really like on HGTV or?
Yeah. So, as a matter of fact, when my husband and I still lived in Oklahoma and we were buying properties on a regular basis, one of us would go every single sheriff's auction that Oklahoma County has. So I think it's a good idea just to go. Now, right now, they're not having, from what I've seen, they're not having as many homes go through the auction as they have in the past. I think that my personal opinion is that will increase over the next 12, 24 months. So any given time when we went in the past, it would have 100+ properties through the rotation. The last one I think he went to, there was only like 20. Right. And that's just because COVID changed a lot of things, but it's definitely a great way. You'll start to meet the attorneys that deal with foreclosures. You'll also start to meet the investors. You're going to start to see, if you go on a regular basis, you'll start seeing who the regulars are. And it's of course a great way to build relationships, but then also understand how the process is. It's not as intimidating as you think. And then of course, if you ever want to become an investor yourself, it's a great way to eventually acquire some property. So I always recommend that any real estate agent, even if you're not an investor, go to at least one and know what the process is, right? It doesn't hurt anything. What's it? I think they're like every other Thursday. So it costs you a couple hours of your time. Has anybody been and want to share their experience? All right. Well, hopefully I hear your feedback and some of you guys go the next auction. If you're in Oklahoma County, you can simply Google Oklahoma County Sheriff's Auction and all the information will show up. So maximum exposure, how do you get maximum exposure on your listings, both online and offline visibility, which is important. Pritesh said, yes, do your research ahead of time. Definitely recommend. And then if you do contract on a property at the auction, you want to get with the title company and do any kind of research there as well. So maximum exposure, of course, you want to put a sign in the yard, but more importantly, besides just a for lease sign in the yard, if you have those little cheap chloroplast signs with special promotions, of course, if it's not against any HOA or city guidelines, you can post those out. Any main directionals, intersections, or in the front of a neighborhood, etc. So a lot of times when we're putting properties up for lease, although we put them on Facebook and Craigslist, a lot of times we get the most calls just by the sign, because I feel like a lot of renters tend to drive around and they know specifically what area they want to move in. Like I said, we do put our rentals on Craigslist. We put them on Facebook groups. We put it on Facebook Marketplace. Also, there's some syndication that we can do through our property management software, Buildium, like apartments.com, et cetera. So we do that syndication, as well as it's always a good idea to have a business page of what's available, have a website. If you're dealing with any kind of government housing, you can even pay to put them on gosection8.com if they're going to be Section 8 approved. And that was always when we had our apartments and we did government housing, we would get a lot of leads through gosection8.com. There's things that you can do to kind of boost the listing in terms of like changing in some photos, changing in the descriptions, adjusting the price to get it back to the top of the list and kind of reboosting, if you will. Also, of course, as a licensee, if you're a member of the MLS, you can put through the MLS for syndication that way. And then as I mentioned, apartments.com. There's some other websites like Zillow, Trulia, et cetera, that I would put through your syndication. So rent collection, what is going to be your policy? Do you accept cash? Are you going to accept cashier's checks or money order? You know, for us, for any deposits, we don't accept cash. It has to be a cashier's check or money order. And then it is specified in our lease that they're going to pay through an online payment software, through a management software. So you might run into some situations where tenants don't have internet access or they don't have computers, and you're going to have to adjust accordingly. So definitely having those conversations with the tenants up front to streamline your processes. If you're dealing with a big complex and you have on-site property management, obviously that's easier because they can have a drop-off location or such. Of course, having a PO box is beneficial. If you don't have an office, to have some type of PO box. You could do direct wires, direct deposits, or even collect in person. The challenge with collecting in person, as you guys know, is it's not scalable. So going and picking up checks is just not something that you can be able to scale over a long period of time. ACH debit, are you going to have it where they can set up automatic payments? Do you accept post-dated checks? I know for us, we don't, but that's just something to consider of what your personal policy is going to be. Or do you accept any blank checks? So what's your late policy going to be? For us, it's after the 3rd for a residential. So any payments after the 3rd of the month is considered late. And then an automatic $50 late fee, which is what I've heard judges consider to be reasonable, is implemented. Now, mind you, this is just a regular year-long residential, it is different for commercial. Offer rewards to responsible tenants, gift cards, promotions, etc. So especially if you're dealing with larger complexes, there's little competitions and reward programs that you can do to reward, good behavior, payments on time, cleanliness, etc. Fees, obviously, as we mentioned, your deposits need to be held in an escrow account. Don't commingle your funds. You should have a good practice of having any type of reserves. Are you going to charge? I'm sure you're going to charge a management fee. What is that fee going to be? And also, are you going to charge a renewal fee? So a lot of property management companies have an ongoing management fee, whether that's 10, 15, 25%, whatever it is, depending if it's a long-term or short-term. But then they might also charge like a contract fee or a renewal fee when it's up for renewal. Also, are you going to charge a pet fee for any pets? Again, pet deposit and pet fee are not the same thing because a pet fee is not refundable, whereas a deposit could be considered refundable and should be held in escrow account. Are you going to charge an eviction fee? That should be all outlined in your contract. So if you are property managing for somebody and you have 3 evictions this month, maybe you charge, for example, a flat $500 eviction fee plus any filing fees, because obviously there's filing fees at the court. Charging for a new lease, any kind of cancellation fee, or admin fines and notices. Any questions so far? Good. All right, reporting, keep your owners in the know. So we talked about how communication is key, not just for the tenants, but also for your staff and then also for the owners. Do not procrastinate, stay on top of repairs. Again, that's one of the biggest complaints I hear about property management companies is tenants turn in repairs and they don't get fixed, which obviously is an annoyance to the tenant, but also could hurt the property itself, which you have a due diligence for your property owner to make sure that you're upholding the standards of the property. Answer tenant inquiries quickly. Tenant inquiries should, in my opinion, be responded to within the maximum 24 hours notice. So it is very much a 24/7 job. You do have to be on call, especially for those emergency type situations. Monthly and annual reporting. Again, that's where a good property management software that has some accounting where you could easily update your owners with some reporting. Quarterly inspections. As we talked about, you could utilize some bug spray times or other inspections to do them all at the same time. That way you're not bothering the tenants more than you have to. You can have a shared Google Drive for photos and receipts. That way you're sharing with the owners of before and after and any repairs that are made. And of course, update paperwork and reporting weekly. And then of course, a good property manager is always going to be organized. All right, scaling for profitability. How many units can you handle? What's your hourly worth? So that really goes in line. Does it make sense for you to property manage? Full transparency. I know some real estate agents that have property managed a handful of properties. They think it's going to be a great way to make residual income. And then after they see the time and effort and liability that's put into it, they realize that they would rather just stick back to sales. So you have to personally decide before making it part of your business plan. Is it worth your return on time, return on investment? Because it is very much a full-time job. So it's hard to do property management part-time. Maximize on every transaction. Automate your business. We talked about the softwares and systems that you can create, leverage and delegate. And then of course, retention. This is another thing that owners are going to look at. Is there a high turnover rate? Or do you have tenants that are with you 4, 5, 10 years? I mean, we have tenants that have been with us for almost 10 years. And at the same property. So what does that retention look like? What does that turnover look like? Because of course, every time you have to turn over a unit, it's costing the owner money in terms of new leases, in terms of repairs, etc. Single family or multifamily, commercial, and then of course, farming a specific area is always a good idea. As far as tenant screening and background checks, you want to set a standard criteria. Again, this is going to protect you from any kind of discrimination that could be set forth. So set a criteria of what's going to be the standards for you, your business, and something that the owners agree to. Be upfront with the requirements. Again, if you have an office, it's good to have that posted so potential tenants can see what the requirements would be. And then of course, stay true to your policy. That's going to help you from getting any kind of hot water. Background, criminal, credit, and eviction checks. So when we do our application, These are the main things that it checks. It checks their background, it checks for any criminal records, it checks their credit, and of course, any past evictions. And I let them know that up front. So I never stop somebody from filling out an application, but usually I let them know up front what categories it's going to check. And then they know whether they're going to pass or pass or fail. Require all tenants to fill out an application. Like I said, if somebody calls you and says, hey, I had an eviction, do you accept evictions? My personal response, and again, I'm not an attorney, would be typically we don't accept anybody that's had a past eviction, but if you would like, I can still send you the application link to fill out an application, and then we can screen it and see if you're approved. So that way I'm never blocking an application. That's where you want to be careful. And then of course you want to do your own due diligence of rental verification with past landlords. So we always make it a common practice to call their current or their past landlords to see what the condition of the unit is, if they've been behind on any payments, and then more importantly, how have they left the property, or if they've given any kind of notice. Does the landlord, it's usually a red flag if the landlord doesn't even know that they're looking for another property. So if the landlord said, yeah, they let us know 30 days ago that they're going to be moving out, then I know that they're, usually somebody that's responsible. Employer verification, of course, verifying their employment, pre-screen prior to showings by letting them know what the requirements are going to be, and then of course, verifying any details. Any questions or any criteria that you guys would add to this that's important? Are you guys here? Go ahead and put in the chat and let me know that you're still here. So Pratish, you asked the question, do you research ahead of time? Absolutely. So that's in relation to the sheriff's auction. You can pull a list of the properties, and normally, we don't spend too much time because there's not any guarantee that you're going to get the properties, but we do a little bit of research, at least mark which properties we're interested in and do the due diligence on those properties. And then of course, once we win the bid, personally, we go in to send the address to our title rep and ask them if there's any concerns or anything on title that we should be aware of. Any questions so far? Anything you guys would like me to elaborate on? All right. So with that said, like I said,